Okay, thank you.
All right, so I think the basic setup here is that what we're going to do is that we're going to launch a little poll to see where you folks sort of stand at the beginning before we have our chat. Then we're going to have opening statements from both Professor Henderson and Professor Manning. And then I'll ask some questions, and then you'll ask some questions, and then we'll vote again. And so with that in mind, I think Will is going to go ahead and launch the first poll. All right, and so the poll question asks whether or not the US should increase its minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour by the year 2025. So go ahead and vote, and then we'll tabulate the responses.
Give it another 5 seconds, then I'll close the poll.
Okay, interesting. So we've got about a third in favor, about 50% against, and the remainder undecided. And so we're going to start with Professor Manning, and he's going to make some statements to begin with, and then we'll go from there. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I can see I've got a bit of work cut out for me here, but I will try and do my best. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about why we have a minimum wage at all. And I think many people really, you think we have a minimum wage because they feel that there's something wrong with a society in which someone who works hard, works full time, can't really earn enough to keep their family out of poverty. And a minimum wage alone can't do that. I'm not going to argue that, but I'm going to say that I think it can be a useful part of the toolkit for doing that. But I think the major concern with the minimum wage is that when you raise it, trying to reduce poverty, that it actually ends up reducing employment, and so effectively ends up harming those it is intended to help. And so I'm going to discuss really what economic theory says we would expect to happen when you raise the minimum wage, and what evidence suggests actually happens. Now, I think sometimes you hear the argument that basically economic theory says that job loss is inevitable when you raise the minimum wage. That's just the laws of economics. And I want to try and convince you that that really isn't the case. And I want to do that by means of an example. So suppose you want to hire a worker who, you've decided they're going to generate revenues for you, your firm, of $12 an hour, net of all other costs. And you have to make the decision about what wage you're going to offer them. And well, first of all, I think we can, agree, well, you're not going to offer them $12 an hour because there's really no margin in it for you if you do. So you're going to offer a lower wage. How much lower? Well, if you offer a low wage, that has the advantage from your perspective that it offers a higher profit margin to you, but there's probably a higher risk that the worker is not going to accept your offer or is going to quit soon after accepting. I think most of us are more inclined to accept job offers that offer better remuneration packages and more likely to leave less likely to leave ones that do. So let's just imagine that you've balanced those competing objectives and you've decided that $8 is what works for you. That's what you're going to offer them. And that's fine when the federal minimum is $7.25. Now suppose the government comes in and says, oh, the minimum wage is $10. You're not allowed to offer $8 anymore. What's going to happen then? Well, you're not going to be very happy about it. Your profit margin is reduced. But you're still going to want to employ the worker because they're generating $12 of revenue for you. So you're still making money from them. And actually, it's even possible that because a higher wage, encourages labour supply, makes people more likely to accept your offer, less likely to quit, that employment may even end up higher. But it's important to understand there are going to be limits to how high the minimum wage can go. In my example, if the government raised the minimum wage above $12, say to $15, you no longer want to employ that worker. There's no money in it for you anymore. So undoubtedly, the minimum wage can be too high, but we need to really look at empirical evidence on what happens in order to decide on the appropriate level of the minimum wage. Now, the literature on the empirical evidence on the employment effects of the minimum wage is enormous. And if you've already made your mind up on the answer to the question, you can find a study that supports your conclusion, whichever side of the debate you're on. Now, my view is that the evidence for job loss from the minimum wage at the current levels is very weak, but the evidence that it raises wages is very strong. And actually, I published an article recently about that, which is meant to be reasonably accessible to sort of it's not very, very technical. So you could read that if you're interested, a bit more detail about what I think. But I'll just illustrate and try and explain, two key pictures. So one of the concerns in the US, debates in the US, has been about the impact of the minimum wage on the labour market for teenagers. And this here, what this diagram here shows you is the result of trying to estimate the impact of the minimum wage on the earnings of teens, how much they actually earn. And what we have on the vertical axis are 7 different ways of estimating that. I'm not going to go into the details of those models. And what we have on the horizontal axis is a measure of the impact on the wage. And basically these are positive numbers, meaning the effect is positive. The dots in the middle are the best estimate for each model, and the width of the line gives us an indication of the uncertainty. And what you can say is different models give different conclusions somewhat, but they're all positive. They're all in the same kind of ballpark. And there's very clear evidence the minimum wage raises the earnings of teens in the US. When we look at the impact on the employment rate, we get something that's very different. So I've marked here with the red line the 0. So anything to the left of that, a negative number, is job loss. Anything to the right is job gain. And you can see here is, yes, you can find a model 1 or model 3 here, in which you say the minimum wage causes job loss. But if you look a bit more widely at a whole suite of models, you come to the conclusion that that's not really a very robust conclusion. But most of these estimates are actually centered about 0. Now that's all about the current level of the minimum wage. But one thing that's very important to know is that the minimum wage in the US currently is very low in relation to average wages in international comparison. So compared to what a full-time median wage, sort of measure of the average wage, the US federal minimum is about 1/3 of that. But in other countries, it's 50% going up to over 60%. And what that means is that if you converted those percentages to what that would mean for the US minimum wage today, the US is at $7.25, but there are lots of other countries around the world that are already at something that's like $12, $13, even up to New Zealand is close to $15. And if you say, well, yes, you can raise the minimum wage that high, but they're going to be terrible costs in terms of the labour market. Well, if you look at the final column, you can see it's not the case that these countries are all basket cases when it comes to the unemployment rate. Obviously, there are lots of factors other than the minimum wage that affect this, but it's not, the sky does not fall in these countries. And, another way of putting that, which is that the US is the richest big country in the world by some margin. And if you're an MBA graduate, you can expect to be on average, the richest MBA graduate in the world. I think that's fair to say. I know my students have been struggling this year finding jobs. I hope it's working out all right for you, those of you who are graduating, but I think over a lifetime, let's say on average, that's right. But if you're a low skill worker in the US, you are not well off in terms, your living standards are not the highest among low skilled workers in the world. In fact, the US is right down, really only just, it's a bit above sort of developing countries, but for example, it's 40% behind, the real living standard of a sort of McDonald's worker in Canada is 40% higher than in the US. And so the US really is an outlier by international standards. And it's not just an outlier by international standards, it's an outlier by its own historical standards. So this gives us the minimum wage in nominal terms. Obviously, it's the highest it's ever been, but the cost of living has risen, so we need to adjust for the cost of living. And a statistic I find extraordinary is that the real living standard of a minimum wage worker on the federal minimum today in the US is the same as a minimum wage worker 70 years ago in 1950. That is an incredible statistic when one thinks of the economic growth since then. And, you know, it was much higher. It was up at the equivalent of $10.50 in 50 years ago. And it really has been allowed to erode over decades. And in fact, for many years, minimum wages in the 50s and 60s kept pace with productivity. If we'd done that, you'd be looking at a minimum wage of $23 an hour today. So a long way from that. Now, you can also see here the rise in the projected rise to $15 over the next 4 years. And you might look at that and think, whoa, that's a big, sharp rise. And it is. Of course, it's trying to undo in 4 years, really decades of neglect. So, I mean, I think the case for a big rise in the federal minimum is overwhelming. It's, you know, very popular. I think there's good reason for that. I think there is more debate about the timing of this and whether $15 is too high. How you do that? How high $15 actually is in 2025 depends on inflation between now and then. We don't really quite know about that, but it'd probably be about something like 60% of full-time median earnings. But Joe Biden's plan is actually uncannily similar to a plan that the current UK government has for raising the minimum wage. Now, the current UK government is a conservative government. That's roughly the equivalent of your Republicans, but a very different attitude to the minimum wage. But it has a multi-year plan to raise the minimum wage to 60% of full-time median earnings. We're about halfway through that plan at the moment. It's a conditional plan. It involves watching the labour market for any adverse reaction and for any adverse shocks. But basically, even though we've had a massive shock with COVID, it's still on track. There are no adverse labour market consequences that have been detected as date. And so, you know, I would expect the UK is going to follow through on its plan. And I think the US should do something essentially the same. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Professor Henderson.
Wait a minute, I gotta, before I start, how did I lose the screen here? There we are, sorry. Good morning or good afternoon to most of you. How should we help poor and low-income people?
I'm just going to interrupt you for a quick second. We can't, if you're trying to share your slides, so we can't see them. So you might want to.
I'm sorry?
We can't see your slides. I don't know if that's.
I don't have slides.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. How should we help poor and low-income people? By giving them more opportunities. The #1 cause of poverty in America is not having a full-time job. The problem with any minimum wage, but especially a high one of $15 an hour, is that it destroys opportunity. It does so by pricing the least skilled workers out of the labor market. The wage someone can earn is closely connected with that person's productivity. Unskilled workers often don't produce enough for an employer to find it profitable to hire them. A high minimum wage, therefore, prices them out of the labor market and slows their progress. Here's a depressing statistic. Of Black men aged 18 to 30 who are not in prison, not in school, and not in possession of a high school degree, only 1 in 3 is employed full-time. Part of that is due to the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. An increase to $15 an hour would make their situation much worse. We should always distinguish between the motives for a policy and the effects of a policy. People with good motives can advocate bad policy, but people with bad motives can advocate those same bad policies. The minimum wage is a case in point. I don't doubt for a minute that Professor Manning has good motives in advocating an increase in the minimum wage. If you look at the history of the minimum wage in the last 100 years in America, though, you find that for the first 35 of those years, some of the strongest advocates of a federal minimum wage were people who wanted to hamper competition from women and from Black people. In 1918, Congress passed a law that set minimum wages for just women and children in the District of Columbia. In the 1923 case, Adkins versus Children's Hospital, the Supreme Court struck down the legislation. Tellingly, it was not just the employer who brought the case. A female elevator operator in a hotel also sued against the law. Presumably, she understood that the minimum wage hampered her ability to compete. In the 1930s, textile firms were moving from high wage to New England to lower wage southeastern states such as South Carolina to be able to hire lower wage Black labor. Northeastern textile firms pushed minimum wages to blunt the competition from the South. This attempt to hamper competition by Black workers was a major factor into the late 1950s. In 1957, a US senator from New England, arguing for an increase in the minimum wage, stated, "Of course, having on the market a rather large source of cheap labor depresses wages outside of that group too, the wages of the white worker who has to compete. And when an employer can substitute a colored worker at a lower wage, and there are, as you pointed out, these hundreds of thousands looking for decent work, it affects the whole wage structure of an area, doesn't it?" Unquote. In other words, he was saying, I don't want Black workers to be able to compete with white workers. That senator was John F. Kennedy. Well, a large increase in the minimum wage would raise wages for many workers, as Professor Manning pointed out. It would also cause the wages of many other workers to fall to zero. They won't find jobs. Other low-wage workers will stay employed, but will work fewer hours a week. Many low-wage workers will find that their non-wage benefits will fall and that employers will work them harder. Why all those effects? Because an increase in the minimum wage doesn't magically make workers more productive. A minimum wage of $15 an hour will exceed the productivity of many low-wage workers. The main reason some workers earn low wages is not that employers are greedy exploiters. If exploitation were enough to explain low wages, then why would employers ever pay anyone more than $7.25 an hour? Wage levels reflect two things: workers' productivity and competition among employers, which is crucial. We all understand that when we see discussions about why one football player makes $20 million a year and another makes only $10 million a year. Everyone recognizes the twin facts of player productivity and competition among NFL teams. The same principles, but with much lower wages, apply to competition among employers for relatively low-skilled employees. In the past 25 years, there has been controversy among economists about how many jobs will be lost. Some economists think job losses will be large, and others think it will be small or non-existent. You could easily conclude that there's no longer a consensus among economists that an increase in the minimum wage would cause job loss. But that conclusion would be wrong. UC Irvine economists David Newmark and Peter Shirley, an economist with the West Virginia legislature, showed that in a January 21 study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Newmark is one of the leading US scholars on the economic effects of minimum wages. Newmark and Shirley read every published study of the effects of the minimum wage on jobs in the United States that was done between 1992 and the time of their study. For each study, they identified the core estimates of the effects of minimum wages on employment. When that was difficult to do, they contacted the study's authors to ask them what they regarded as their bottom line estimates. 66 studies met their criteria, and these criteria had nothing to do with the size or direction of the estimates. Here's what they found. The vast majority of studies, 79.3%, found that a higher minimum wage led to less employment. Moreover, they found the evidence, quote, of negative employment effects is stronger for teens and young adults and more so for the less educated, unquote. They concluded that the commonly heard refrain that minimum wages don't destroy jobs, quote, requires discarding or ignoring most of the evidence, unquote. Moreover, virtually all the studies of the effects of minimum wages in the United States have considered increases of between 10 and 25%. The US government has never raised the minimum wage by anything close to the 107% envisioned in the increase from 725 to 15. Why does that matter? Because the higher the increase as a percent of the existing minimum wage, the more certain we are that it will hurt job opportunities for unskilled workers. The effects of the minimum wage would vary a lot from state to state. In New York in 2019, the median hourly wage was $22.44. So a $15 minimum would affect a fairly small percent of New York's labor force. In Alabama, by contrast, the median hourly wage in 2019 was only $16.73. So the $15 minimum in Alabama would hurt a much greater percent of the labor force. The University of Chicago's Booth School's Initiative on Global Markets recently made the following statement and asked 43 economists to agree or disagree. Here's the statement. A federal minimum wage of 15 per hour would lower employment for low-wage workers in many states, unquote. Unfortunately, they didn't define many. Of those who agreed or disagreed, 19 agreed that it would cause job loss in many states, and only 6 disagreed. That's 76% to 24%. One who disagreed, Richard Thaler, stated, quote, the literature suggests minimal effects on employment, unquote. No, it doesn't. As I noted earlier, the federal government has never tried to double the minimum wage, and so there's little scholarly research on such an increase. Would Thaler say that if putting a cat in the oven at a temperature of 72.5 degrees doesn't hurt the cat, putting a cat in the oven at 150 degrees wouldn't hurt either? While few economists have estimated the effects of such a large increase in the minimum wage, the US Congressional Budget Office presented its economist estimate in March. The CBO estimated that the increase would reduce US employment by 0.9%. That's 1.4 million workers put out of work. But wouldn't the increase in the minimum wage also increase wages for a lot of workers who keep their jobs? Yes, and that's Professor Manning's point. And the CBO estimates that although the workers who lose their jobs would lose income, their loss over the years from 2021 to 2031 would be only 34% of the gain to the workers who gain wages. But the gain in wages is not an unalloyed benefit to those who gain. Employers looking for ways to avoid paying more to workers than their productivity is worth would search out other ways of reducing overall compensation. They might cut non-wage benefits, work the employees harder, or reduce training, to name 3. In an article in the winter 2021 issue of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, UC San Diego economist Jeffrey Clemens noted a negative correlation between minimum wages and employer-provided health insurance. In the workplace, as in the rest of the world, there's no free lunch. In short, the case against the increase in the minimum wage to 15 an hour is that it would put over 1 million workers out of work, making it hard for them to climb the economic ladder, would reduce work hours for those who manage to keep their jobs, would reduce training on the job, and would reduce other non-wage benefits for low-skilled workers. The best way to help people to make money is to get them on the economic ladder so they can work their way up. The minimum wage makes it harder for many people, especially those without high school degrees, to get on that first rung. A $15 minimum wage would put that rung even more out of reach for many people. Let's expand opportunities, not destroy them. For goodness sake, don't price them out of the labor market.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to ask some follow-up questions and then we'll have some students jump in as well. Of course, I always come with pictures. So I want to ask a couple of questions, and I want to start by thinking about some of that historical experience that you alluded to.
I think we see the Zoom session. So if you have 2 screens.
Yeah, checks out. There you go. Better?
Perfect.
All right, good. Okay, so I want to allude to some of that historical experience that you talked about. And, you know, as those of you who had me in class know, I normally study healthcare markets, so I had to go do some digging to understand a little bit better myself as well. And so this is an interesting picture that I found in a recent paper showing sort of expansions in minimum wage coverage over time within the US. And I'll talk a little bit more about this paper in a second. But I think what's interesting to me in this figure is actually just the y-axis. So this is all in 2017 dollars, and you see that the y-axis only goes up to $12 an hour. And so, Professor Manning, let's start with you, because you mentioned the sort of international comparison. But I think it's interesting to note that we've never experimented with a minimum wage as high as $15 an hour in the U.S. Do you have any sense of why you think this has become the focal point of the current debate? And do you think this focal point is a good or bad starting point?
Well, I think, there's an element of truth that $15 has got a nice ring to it. I always think that if you want to show you've really thought about it, you should say you think the minimum wage should be $14.93, because it suggests a great deal of thought to the question. I think the comparison, as I pointed out in my talk, and this is sort of similar a little bit, the minimum wage, the living standard of a minimum wage worker in the US today is lower than it was 50 years ago. But the US economy is much more productive. The average worker in the US produces much more than they did 50 years ago. And so as a fraction of average earnings, $10 in 1968 was much higher than $10 it would be today. And, so I think that's, if I go back to one of my slides, when I say, well, suppose we'd kept the minimum wage growing in line with the average level of productivity in the US economy, we'd actually be at a minimum wage of $22 a day. And with that comparison, $15 actually looks pretty moderate.
Okay, so Professor Henderson, you seem skeptical of $15 an hour. What do you think of $22 an hour? More specifically, what do you think about the argument that as productivity per worker is increasing, that the minimum wage should keep track?
Well, the problem is which workers. So overall average productivity is going up, but you've got a lot of low productivity workers. So if it's really true that there are these workers out there whose productivity is, say, 16 an hour, and people are paying them $7.25, that's not an equilibrium. And actually that relates to something Professor Manning said. He gave an example where the employee's productivity is 12 and the employer pays 8. That's good. That's a good start. But then what did he leave out? Competition. I'm an employer. I see someone whose productivity is worth 12. So we don't just get to 8. I offer 9, someone else offers 10. I agree with him. You're probably not going to go all the way to 12, but you could get to 11, 11.50 just with competition. And so that's an important point that's left out in his discussion.
So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I think this point about competition is very interesting. And so I think it's worth thinking a bit. Always going forwards and backwards in your slides is dangerous. But I think it's worth thinking about part of the assumption that you made in that argument, which is something about the level of competition in the labor market. One concern that you could have is that the labor market just isn't as competitive as it used to be, in part because of the rise of large dominant firms. And so here's some work looking at what happens when Amazon implements a voluntary minimum wage, not for employees of Amazon, but for employees in those labor markets. And so what we see is that when Amazon raises its wages, other firms follow suit, and we do see spillover effects of the Amazon minimum voluntary minimum wage. Now, that sort of rules out the story that you just had in mind, where this perfectly competitive market sort of takes care of this problem. And so how would you respond to the claim that your argument no longer works if employers have a lot of market power?
It doesn't go against my argument. I never said the word perfectly competitive. I said competitive. Markets are competitive. You can have a lot of competition. In fact, one of the standard people who study railways found there are two major railways in the United States that don't really act like a duopoly. They're intensely competitive. So you can have lots of competition with small numbers of competitors. But if it's true, as you say, that Amazon raised the wage and other people followed, that's evidence in favor of what I'm saying. Other employers followed by raising their wages.
Professor Manning, I know you've thought a lot about this. What would you say in response?
I mean, I think I agree. I mean, the question, one of the key questions is how competitive are labor markets. And, so how powerful are the forces that drive wages close to productivity, or is there a big gap there? But I think there's just a lot of evidence that labor markets are just not as competitive as sort of economic textbooks normally assume. And, one way of putting that is that, it's a big deal when we get jobs, when we lose jobs and so on. Now, if the labor market is very competitive, we don't care about losing this job. There's another one just like it down the road. We don't care, we don't celebrate when we get a job because there's another one, they're just two a penny. And it isn't like that. When people are asked, what's the most important thing that happened to you in your last year, after sort of births, marriages, deaths, divorces and things, the thing they say is about jobs, because jobs, jobs are precious to people. It's not that easy to find a good job. And that speaks to the fact that the labor markets are not as competitive as I think many people think. And I think the evidence on the employment effects of the minimum wage bears out that conclusion.
Well, can I respond quickly?
Yeah, sure.
I agree with you that it, you lose a job, it's a big deal. I've done that. But if it's a low wage, unskilled worker losing a job with a relatively low minimum wage, those kinds of services are relatively fungible. It's actually easier for that low wage worker, low skilled worker to find a job somewhere else than it is for, say, an economics professor who, didn't get tenure or something. There's a lot of search there. And so I agree with your basic point, Alan, but I think the point at least applies to is low wage, unskilled workers.
Good. So I think a lot of the discussion here has had to do with sort of heterogeneity and impact across different groups of people. And this is related to something you both touched on, and I want to go back, which is sort of income inequality. And you both touched on this in different ways. And so Professor Manning, I stole a picture from one of your papers that sort of plots here. We have the relative cut of the minimum wage. And then we also have some details about rising income inequality. Do you think that these two series are related? And how should I think about the relationship between the minimum wage and inequality in the US?
Well, first of all, I think the minimum wage is actually very important in determining the amount of wage inequality at the bottom end of the labour market, but not so much at the top end. And I think that may show the top end because it's the 90 relative to the.
Yeah, I liked that picture better, so I took the 90-50.
But I would say that in the US, the earnings of the bottom end, people at the bottom relative to the average has fallen over time. We've seen pictures on that. And sometimes that's presented as an inevitable feature of technology, of globalization, whatever. But what I would say is in the UK experience, we've reversed that. We've got the lowest level of wage inequality at the bottom of the distribution now for 40 years because we've raised the minimum wage. And, we've done that without causing big job losses. Before COVID hit, we had the lowest unemployment rate for 50 years. We had the highest fraction of people in employment for 40 years. We actually went through a period in the 1990s where we had no minimum wage at all. And it wasn't the case that suddenly all these low skilled people that David talks about found jobs and so on. And, so the minimum wage in the UK is just now universally regarded across the political spectrum as one of the success stories. And I really think it's not right to say that we have no experience of something like $15. When you look at countries like the UK, other countries, we do have experience of that and we know that it works.
So I think something that's interesting is that income inequality is particularly pronounced in the US. And so you argued that the minimum wage is one tool that you can think about in the toolkit to address that inequality. Professor Henderson, what other tools in the toolkit would you prefer to using something like a minimum wage to address income inequality?
Well, I will get to that. I just want to reply briefly to a point Alan made that I disagree with. And that is David Splinter, an economist at the US Treasury, has done some work that's much more careful than the work of people like Thomas Piketty and so on, that finds that this apparent increase in inequality of income over the last few decades is more apparent than real. I mean, there's some, but there's not the big increase when you look at it carefully. The other point is that, okay, so the other point is that Alan had in one of his slides, have a minimum wage so people can raise a family. I think that's putting the family too soon. I think it's quite reasonable for people to get on the economic ladder, work their way up, acquire skills, and then marry or whatever, or have a family, and then it's more doable. So the idea that a minimum wage should be able to support a family, I think is unrealistic. Now, as to what I would do, in an earlier version of this, I had a longer thing, so I couldn't fit it in. There are 800 occupations in the United States for which some state governments require licenses. We went from a labor market, and by the way, you mentioned Alan Kruger. Kruger has done some work on this, or did some work on this, he has died. Kruger has done some serious work on this, where he finds that something like 5% of workers back in 1950 were in jobs where you required a license. Now it's 29%. And so it's not just things like doctors and lawyers, it's hair cutters, it's cornrow braiders. In some states, you have to take a class in how to use chemicals in order to be a cornrow braider. And guess what? You're a cornrow braider, you don't use chemicals. So there's just there are a lot of ways that make it difficult. And these licensing laws disproportionately hurt people at the bottom end of the wage scale.
Okay, so we have sort of the occupational licensing as an important impediment to sort of economic opportunity. Professor Manning, what do you think are the other important tools in the toolkit to address inequality, thinking about either the UK context or the US context?
Well, I think, Dave, I think the first thing that sort of David said almost is something I agree with, is that the minimum wage is, is an hourly wage. And so that if you're not working any hours or many hours, the hourly, the minimum wage can't help those people, and it doesn't help those people. So I think we need to also have something that provides some level of support for those people as well. I think we also kind of need to think about, increasing productivity of people. I think the proposal for raising the minimum wage, actually part of a package, involves things like more and better training as well. But I think actually the minimum wage can also help there. Actually, this is a really interesting paper by, I think, one of your colleagues, some of your colleagues, Amanda, which kind of looked at what happened to the productivity. Oh, and we haven't colluded, I should promise.
No, we didn't.
in this, which looked at what happened, had measures of individual worker productivity, it's quite hard to find, and looked at what happened to that when the minimum wage went up. And what they found is that productivity actually rose more or less in line with the minimum wage, and they didn't find any job losses. So I think it's a mistake to think of someone's productivity as being this fixed kind of thing that is sort of immutable. It responds to economic policy much like anything else.
Good. So some of you will have had Professor De Serrano for decks, I believe. And so this is the data that she's analyzing when she's not helping you with problem sets, thinking about the relationship between the minimum wage and productivity of workers. And so I think this is an interesting point, because it suggests that worker characteristics are not immutable, they're not fixed. There's some interplay between the job and the worker that's likely to be important. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that firm decisions are not fixed either. And I think it's worth thinking about how firms might react to big increases in the minimum wage. And so one thing that you could imagine is some substitution between labor and capital. So instead of having, more employees at a McDonald's, you have order kiosk. And you might also imagine that they might raise prices to consumers. So increasing the price of a Big Mac, for example. So Professor Henderson, how would you think about firms strategically reacting to the minimum wage? And do any of the arguments that you've made so far, how would those change in a world where firms can adjust their strategies?
Well, they become stronger. In other words, to the extent that people can substitute into capital, and that's easy, there'll be even more of an employment effect. And by the way, one of the problems with all the studies, ones that find an effect, ones that don't, is the timing. So you have an employer that anticipates a minimum wage increase. That employer might shift to this now, as I'm seeing in McDonald's in Monterey, where I live, and not wait for it to hit 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever. And so that makes the data kind of squishier. I also want to point out the professor you showed, I've forgotten her name. I did see what it said underneath, and this was the effects of a $1 increase in the minimum wage, not the effect of a $7.75 increase in the minimum wage.
Ironically, that should work. So her argument is that you get productivity increases for increases in the minimum wage. I mean, if you think the effects are monotonic, which you might or might not, then a bigger increase in the minimum wage might mean a bigger productivity increase.
Right, and I think it's not monotonic. I think it's such a small increase. It's just hard to generalize.
So this is an interesting argument. So then your argument is that a large increase in the minimum wage, rather than being able to extrapolate from the current evidence we have, is such a discontinuous change that we should expect discontinuous employment effects. Professor Manning, what do you think about that argument?
Well, what I would say is that, I don't think, the evidence actually supports that. Again, I mean, I know that the US hasn't had minimum wages that high in relation to average earnings for decades, but it did in the past, and other countries do now. So I think if you want a sort of indication of what is going to happen, I understand the concern. I mean, it is a big rise over a short period of time, but you want to kind of, look at what's happening in those other countries. A McDonald's worker in Canada, as I said, earns 40% more than a McDonald's worker in the United States. And, do I think that's really because the productivity of that kind of burger flipper is so very different? I don't really think that it is. McDonald's is a very standardized operation. So although I understand these are concerns, I mean, I'm not, I think there are limits to how high you can push the minimum wage. I think when you have a balanced look at the evidence, you conclude that the risks are actually not very big. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with also, I mean, when David says raising the minimum wage, doubling it, and the proposal is not to double it tomorrow. It's over 4 years. There is a scope of, looking at what's happening, seeing what's happening, and possibly readjusting. I mean, that's exactly what the UK Conservative government has done over the last 5 years, since it's raised the minimum wage by a lot for workers in 2016.
I just want to point out, can I point something out? That remember, we're debating an increase in the federal minimum wage. So, are you going to see an effect in New York City, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, all these very high wage areas? No. But remember the point I made about Alabama. And even, by the way, the median hourly wage in 2018 in non-metropolitan New York, in other words, rural New York State, was $13.30. So it's really playing with fire to increase it everywhere. So if I think Alan would make a stronger case if he said each state government, I still wouldn't like it, but I dislike it way less if he said each state government should be able to set a minimum wage. You would not see Alabama or Arkansas coming anywhere close to 15.
So I'm relatively confident that the UK also has major metropolitan and rural areas. Has there been big differences in the impacts across those labor markets in the UK's experience?
Well, in the UK experience, that's a big concern, has been a big concern as well. And we do have big gaps. I mean, I think the gap between our highest wage area, which is London, unsurprisingly, and the lowest, which is Northern Ireland, I think London is about 50% higher. I think that's actually very similar to the gap between the highest and the low wage states in the US. So of course, people think about what is the impact going to be in these lower wage parts of the country. So there are lots of studies of that. And again, they find no evidence of job losses by that. But I think you've also, I mean, what David is doing is a little bit naughty. I mean, comparing an average level of wages in 2018 with a proposed minimum wage in 2025 is slightly apples and pears in there. I mean, you've got to sort of scale it up, and either scale the $15 back down to 2018 dollars, or scale the 2018 dollars up to what you expect them to be in 2025.
Well, that's true. So if you go 2% inflation, it compounds to about 15%. So $15 then compared to 2018, subtract 15%, you're at $12.75.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where you would find Northern Ireland is in the UK. It's a similar kind of, picture, really.
All right, so I think this is a good spot to see if some of the students have some questions, and if not, I'll jump in with some Will wanted to ask as well. So just go ahead. I think we're just going to do blue hands if you have any questions, and I will call on you. Or worse yet, I can cold call you. Alex.
Can we see Alex or no?
You should be able to see me.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah. So my question, one of the things that was brought up was that competition and increased competition is a good way to kind of increase wages and ensure there's kind of a healthy market for labor. But wouldn't increasing the minimum wage so high most likely benefit the largest firms like the Walmarts and Amazons that can best afford to have those wages at the expense of maybe the small business owners or independents who really can't afford that increase? So you'd have maybe more market consolidation, less competition, and thus maybe, worse effects for consumers and for labor.
Can I go first?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's true. In other words, and in fact, I remember when that guy I think it was with Walmart, came out, and the CEO came out in favor of an increased minimum wage. And it's like they were already paying, and it wasn't to 15, by the way, but they were already paying what the minimum wage he proposed was. It was when President Obama proposed $10.10. And so they were already paying that. And he's saying, he never said it, of course, but I think he's saying, I want to hobble my competitors, the smaller firms that aren't paying 10.10.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I mean, again, that's been another question that a lot of people have looked at in the UK context, because it's quite a, it's a natural kind of thing to worry about. And I think, there is some redistribution of employment away from smaller to larger businesses. I think the question of whether that's a good or a bad thing, I mean, I think there are a number of factors on that. So, for example, one of the reasons smaller firms can't pay higher wages is that they're less productive. So actually the reallocation of workers to bigger firms raises the average level of productivity in the economy, and that's a good thing. But you're right to say you might worry about the effect of that and competition in the labour market or in the product market. And in the labour market, obviously the minimum wages prevents these firms, which might have more market power, from actually exercising it. But you could worry about those things. I mean, I'd just come back to the point that, you've got to look at all of these things in the round. There's no policy which is going to be fantastic in absolutely every dimension. And I think the experience net, my view is this will be a good thing.
All right, Manelli.
All right, so thank you for this very interesting debate. So one of the arguments that Professor Manning gave for raising the minimum wage is to increase boost the wages of people already in the labor market, people already working. But it seems to me the more pertinent question there is, what is the most effective way of boosting the wages of people who are already working? And if there is a more efficient way of doing that doesn't have the negative externality of pushing some people out of the labor market, such as an expansion of the earned income tax credit, or in my view, even better, a negative income tax system, then what is the basis for using minimum wage increases to increase the wages of people who are already working?
Professor Manning, why don't you start?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I would certainly see something like the EITC or negative income tax as part of a package I mentioned at the beginning. But I think one of the disadvantages of those policies is that they are actually a subsidy to employers to cut wages, because if they cut wages, basically the state picks up a share of the cut. And, you know, when you provide an incentive for people to do things, they start doing it. So one of the worries about those kind of policies on their own is that they encourage employers to cut wages. And as a result, you know, the employers start getting some of the benefits, not the workers. And so the minimum wage prevents that. So I see these as complements to each other. They're not substitutes to each other. They actually, you need them both as a package. So I'm, you know, I think I'm in favor of what you're talking about, but not instead of a minimum wage, alongside the minimum wage.
So I would like to have neither the EITC nor the NIT, but my ranking, but we do have an EITC. So I think it's a way better policy than the minimum wage. And I think it's better than the negative income tax. And let me say why. And that is that it does increase the incentive to work. Now, it is true, as Professor Manning points out, if that shifts the supply curve, the equilibrium wage will fall somewhat. But think of it this way: why put all the burden? The minimum wage puts all the burden on the employer. Why do that? If we as a society want to help low-income people or poor people, why should we single out employers, the ones actually providing jobs, as the people to penalize? The advantage from that viewpoint of trying to have everyone pay for of the earned income tax credit, and even the negative income tax, although I think it's less good as far as productivity or employment effects, is that at least taxpayers in general, generally high income taxpayers, are paying for it, as opposed to singling out employers. And that's why I think it would be better. But I still want to go with let's try just loosening up that labor market. Let's try letting people sell things out of trucks without getting a license and all that kind of stuff. And let's see where we get.
All right, Tuba.
Hi there. Thanks. So I was curious, I think there's been a lot of talk about like whether 15 is the right number, but if the minimum wage is, if it's debatable whether it should keep track with the increase in productivity rates, I'm curious, Professor Henderson, what you think about just whether as a floor, it should at least keep track with inflation, like the increase in inflation since 2009, which was the last time the inflation rate was set, or the minimum wage rate was set.
Right, I don't. And the reason is I think the minimum wage is bad because it puts people out of work. I'm saying the $15 minimum wage or inflation indexing even would put more people out of work. So there can be jobs where someone could say work for $4 an hour and gradually become productive, and 10 years later is making 20 an hour. Those kinds of things happen. I mean, I think of a job I had in a summer resort in Canada where I grew up, where I made 25 cents more than minimum wage. I did some math this morning to figure out if we had the $15 minimum wage, convert it to Canadian dollars, it would be now double the wage I was paid. Would I have been employed? I'm not sure. So no, I don't think it's a good idea to index it. And also remember, the measure we have of employment, of productivity, is from people working. What's the unseen, to use a 19th century economist Frederick Bastier's idea? The unseen is the people not working now because that minimum wage is too high for them. So for example, the 18 to 30-year-old Black workers not in prison, not in school, and no high school degree, where 1 in 3 is working now.
Professor Manning, selection of people into the labor force is going to affect productivity statistics, but what do you think, what is your best argument for indexing to inflation or to productivity growth, and which would you prefer?
I mean, I think it's natural to sort of index it to sort of average earnings, to be quite honest, which maybe in a well-functioning economy we think tracks average productivity. It hasn't been in the US in recent years. That's perhaps a different topic for another debate. But so I think that's very natural. But I think we know what happens in the UK. As I said earlier, we had a period in the 1990s when we had no minimum wage at all. outside agriculture? Did we have lots of, people coming into employment and so on? No, we didn't. When Tony Blair proposed introducing the minimum wage, we had people saying, oh, this is going to cost, literally, they said this is going to cost hundreds of thousands of millions of jobs. And then when he actually did it, went from nothing to, quite a modest minimum wage, but from nothing, that's a big increase. Those people were just proved they were just wrong. And, that's one of the big reasons that we've got such a political consensus in the UK on the minimum wage now, is that we've had, people across the spectrum sort of just looking at the evidence in an open-minded kind of way. And those people who said the sky is going to fall in if you do this, they were just proved wrong and they lost credibility.
But
So
remember,
I have one more question that I actually don't know the answer to, that I think speaks a little bit to this question of the relative levels. What percentage of workers in the US currently earn between $7.25 an hour and $15 an hour?
I should have checked that, and I don't know. I think I can.
I should have checked that. It's high. I mean,
I would bet 25%, but I don't know.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of the potential impact on both employment and on raising standards of living for those workers. And so I think we're running close on time. So Will, if you want to go ahead and launch that poll again, we'll see where we ended up.
We'll give it 5 more seconds, then I'll cut it off.
All right, relatively unchanged. I think this is proof of the virtue of two-handed economist. So on the one hand, on the other hand. So Will, I'll kick it over to you to wrap us up.
Yeah, so just to recap, the pre for agree was 32%, then we shifted to 34%. The disagree remained unchanged at 50%, and then the undecided decreased by 2%. That 2% gain was to Professor Manning. So by a 2% change, I think technically, Professor Manning, you're the winner. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining, and then especially for our moderator, Professor Starc, and then our great debaters, Professor Manning and Professor Henderson. Thank you so much for joining, and hope everybody enjoyed the debate. But with that, thank you.
Before you close, can I say something?
Absolutely.
Amanda, I've never seen a moderator so prepared. Like, I'm not used to moderators having their own data sets for us to look at and quickly grok. So that was impressive. And Alan,
yeah, no, but I second that, and thank you all for coming and so on. I think it's very kind. I think it was a statistical tie, probably. Maybe 1%.
That feels like a good summary of minimum wage argument.
Thank you to the students.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.